Atish, you mentioned like defining the frameworks, and you mentioned that, and it almost was like in like a is easy for people to do that. So I'm imagining like you've got a really good defined framework for how you approach growth. And so I was wondering like how'd you go about defining the framework for the early growth organization? Like what was that like, and what's your approach there? Can you just tell us the secrets, man?
I mean, to be honest, I don't know if there's like one clean framework that you apply from company to company. I think the way I view it is understanding the goals and the outcomes we're trying to drive towards, building out the guardrails or the approaches that you are open to taking along the way to drive towards those outcomes, then taking a very iterative mentality of what are the things that we can do today, how do you sort of measure the impact along the way, and really balancing it through a portfolio approach of some longer term strategic bets, some things that are very concrete obvious things to invest in, but really along the way have a strong rigor around measurement, strong approach for being extremely introspective. Is you'll do things that you end up having much more impact than you anticipate, and then you'll also do things that don't have the impact that you anticipate. And it's really crucial to take your learnings, feed them back into your future investments. So that's sort of more on the work front, and along the way building out a really strong cross-functional partnership. On the people front, I think it's really bringing the right kinds of people who, in this context, gravitate towards these early stages where each individual can have a massive footprint on the company's future. At the same time, is really eager to roll up their sleeves, understand that there's still a lot of ambiguity, but really hustle to make things happen. And three, approach things from a very high velocity, but at the same time, long term mentality. And that's a tricky balance where you're trying to really do what's best for the company for the longer term, but you do want to maintain a really high velocity of shipping things, measuring impact, and going from there. So, really building the team with that kind of growth muscle in mind is important. I like the last piece I'll say is that like I'm coming from Apple, which is a completely different company of a different scale, and there are certain aspects that are common across these companies, like how you view growth, how you think about data and measurement. At the same time, for each of these cases, it's really important to understand where the company is in its journey. Is it already doing really well, and we're trying to have material impact to accelerate the business? What are the areas where it's potentially struggling? What are the big gaps? And using that lens. So it takes some time to sort of understand the company ecosystem and weave that into your frameworks of thinking.
I have so many follow-up. I knew you were gonna have a really great framework for that. I was like, you just like wrote a master class in 3 minutes or less. Before I jump in, John, this is your territory. You are deep in building out this organization. What follow-up questions do you have here about the growth organization in that framework?
Yeah, I definitely really appreciate what Atish and Shannon shared so far, especially what I think Shannon said earlier about sustainable growth and the balance between short term versus medium term. And I think you said something about having the right guardrails in place and having some of the cross functional partnerships. Are there any? Because I'd like to really learn and maybe even copy some examples. What are some like examples of guardrails or important agreements or ways of working that you've established with partners and people on your teams to really try to balance between short-term and long-term growth? Because often in a startup, at least what I've seen is you're from quarter to quarter, sometimes you're trying to hit a lot of these growth goals, and the easiest way to do it is many times just to continue to iterate on what is known, and the balance between that and putting the right research and development and technical work in place to do more of a moonshot.
Yeah, good question. I don't know if there's a silver bullet here necessarily, but I do think that it's important to have a prioritization framework across these say, longer term speculative bets that potentially have a shot of like 5 years later we look back as the big game changer for the company, laying those out and being rigorous about even though they're long term moonshots, how would we sort of evaluate, de-risk them, learn from feedback from our creators, but also in the shorter term. And I meant like shorter term also, it's having a longer term perspective along your short term bets. So essentially, you have these low hanging fruit. You're making there's a bunch of things you can do, and you're trying to drive impact. You should be really careful about measuring the long-term impact of your short-term bets, which is that you make this change, it perhaps drive member acquisition. Oftentimes what will happen is that it's perhaps a novelty bias that diminishes over time, and you don't necessarily inflect long-term financial trajectory by making short-term changes. So it's really crucial to sort of, in your measurement framework for short-term investments, still anchor it along sort of, are you truly driving member acquisition? Are you changing the member retention in a way that's still not inducing increased churn over a period of time? So having the sort of right methodology around that. But to your first question, I would say that it's having a balance that provides the team or the teams enough room to have some of these longer term bets, but bring a lot of holistic thinking along them across product, data, design, engineering, execs, so that we've come up with a holistic perspective and maximize our chances of winning at those speculative bets and being iterative along the way. And among the shorter term ones, I think laying out the right growth principles of how you measure impact, uh, what are the key metrics that you're trying to drive, how would we bring creators along on our journey. And this is like, I'm talking in sort of Patreon terms, but this is not unique to Patreon. Even at Apple, there's various examples where we wanted to run some tests, some cross-functional partners don't necessarily agree with it. And then over time, as you start building wins and accumulate a lot of trust, often they'd sort of come back to my teams and say, why aren't we doing that? And I'd say, no, because you didn't want to do that 3 months back. And so just building a trust of right rigor and measurement is really crucial.